Morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Capitalist Cast. Joining me today is Albert Eisenberg of Broad and Liberty. Could you explain a little bit for people who aren't familiar what Broad and Liberty is?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Leo. Broad and Liberty is a Southeastern PA-based media publication and think tank. We were founded in 2019. I'm a co-founder along with 4 others. We saw some sort of systemic issues in the media environment, people's fairly mainstream opinions not being taken seriously, not being reported on. So we decided to found our own outlet that was dedicated to the pursuit of truth, showing reality as it is and not as a certain small core of progressive journalists want it to be, and giving people an outlet where their opinions and their perspectives on the world can be represented, as well as doing hard news. So we've grown a lot in the last 2 years, a little over 2 years now. We regularly reach tens of thousands of Pennsylvanians, New Jerseyans, Delawareans a month. So we're regional, and we have issued our first white paper report on redistricting just as the Pennsylvania legislature goes through the decennial progress of deciding who is represented in Washington and how the lines are drawn. So that's what's sort of exciting for us.
Yeah, we actually just put the link up in our comments here, so people can go and check out that the link to the white paper and to the article. And for anybody who's watching this on YouTube, we will also make sure to put this the link in there as well. The redistricting process is obviously it's fairly contentious. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the basics of it for people who aren't familiar with it, particularly as it relates to Pennsylvania. How does the process actually work?
Sure. So yes, you're right. The redistrict, anytime that decisions are made about how people are represented in government, unless you're living in an autocracy where one person makes the decisions, or you're living in a direct democracy or anarchy, anything in between those where there are people who are representing other people and pulling the levers of government, you have controversy, you have different factions, whether they are religious or ethnic or geographic factions vying for power and influence. And this is something that is older than the country itself. And in the report, we actually go back to some very interesting colonial, pre-colonial and colonial Pennsylvania factionalism, including between like Anglicans and Quakers and people in Western PA versus Central and Northeastern PA. And there's a ton of interesting ways that people have vied for power. So there's some faction there's a portion of the sort of academic left that says, oh, we'll just hand this over to experts, the line drawing, and things will be fine. But that's its own form of factionalism. So that's one of the findings of the report. As far as the actual concrete methods and processes for redistricting and creating federal and state districts, so that is drawing the lines that say, okay, this is Congressional District 1, this is Congressional District 2, and they're in different places. And I live here, so I'm represented in Congressional District 2, but I used to live here, so I was in 1, and these are my representatives in Washington, these are my representatives in Harrisburg, these are my representatives in Philadelphia City Council. Those decisions are made, at least for the federal and state seats, on the decennial in conjunction with the U.S. Census, which is laid out in the U.S. Constitution, that there shall be a census every 10 years of who's living where. That's not a direct quote. So the census came out, and every 10 years, the states find out where they rank and how many congressional seats they're allotted, because the congressional seats, for fairness, have to be representative of a relatively similar amount of people. That's Supreme Court jurisprudence, as well as some constitutional indication. So Pennsylvania is losing a congressional seat. So every 10 years, the states find out, and the states that are growing, like in the Sun Belt, historically California, although for this cycle, California is losing a seat for the first time in its history, which is pretty interesting. So Pennsylvania is going from 18 congressional seats, 18 allocated representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives. We have 2 senators like every state, and the U.S. House, the lower house of the federal government, is the people's house, and it grows or shrinks in conjunction with the amount of people in every state, although the number of representatives stays the same that go to Washington, just the state's allocation get different according to their population. So Pennsylvania has to shrink from 18 congressional districts to 17 congressional districts, which means somebody's going to be the odd man out of our 18 Congress people once the musical chairs stop going. So it's up to the Pennsylvania legislature, which is your original question. I'm rambling a bit about the kind of
no. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to redistricting, and you're doing a great job going through everything. So thank you.
Thanks. I find it very interesting. I think anybody who cares about what decisions are being made, I mean, some people's eyes glaze over when you get to these sort of wonky policy things, but it's really interesting and people should really tune in because all these different states are deciding and they're cutting things one way or another, and it completely affects the composition of Congress. So anyway, the Pennsylvania legislature is now in charge of holding hearings, looking at maps that people submit, and deciding what the 17 congressional districts from 2020 to 2030 are going to look like in Pennsylvania. So actually from 2022 to 2032, because the 2020 elections happened, we had the presidential election, but we had congressional elections, and everybody's serving until 2022, unless somebody like Connor Lamb resigns his seat to run for Senate, although I think he's keeping his. So now it's the state legislature's job with the Republican majority, Democratic minority to come up with maps that are drafted and are voted on and go to the governor's desk for a signature. And the rules vary by state. Now, I know you're going to ask me about the state Supreme Court and how the judiciary has interfered with this. So the process should be that the state legislature draws the lines, comes to a conclusion, and drafts the maps, and then the governor signs.
So let's just back up a little bit here, because you had mentioned we're going from 18 to 17 seats. Pennsylvania has been losing representation for quite a long time when it comes to what's happening with our population relative to other states. So this isn't, you referenced, kind of the musical chairs. We've been losing chairs pretty much every 10 years for, I'm not sure how long it's been, but it's been quite a long time that we've been losing folks.
Yes.
So when we take a look at, and you had mentioned that the General Assembly, that there's essentially a redistricting panel who meets in order to figure out what Pennsylvania's congressional districts look like. The state house and state senate are a little bit different. But at the federal level, the state government committees of both houses, as along with pretty much everybody and their brother who has an interest in this, say what they think the district should look like. And then the two chambers will get together between the House and the Senate and come to an agreed upon map, essentially. And then they will vote on that. So since Pennsylvania right now has a Democratic governor, Republican House, Republican Senate, it is out of necessity going to have to be a bipartisan agreement on what the districts actually look like, correct?
Yes, which really isn't a bad thing. The problem is that the Democrats in the minority have a stopgap solution which disincentivizes them coming to the table and actually forming a decision, because the state Supreme Court in 2017 and 2018 granted itself the powers to redraw the maps, which was obviously plainly unconstitutional, but was cheered on by the media and by sort of left-wing nonpartisan groups, which we go into in this redistricting report, which viewers can find on broadandliberty.com. As far as the fact that Pennsylvania is losing citizens, so you're correct that when we started, it's obviously there are 435 members of the House, and there have been for a long while. I'm not sure when that number changed, but it's been that way for a century or more. So relative to things, if it was just the 13 colonies, we expanded. So some of those House members naturally have had to go to states like, anywhere west of the Mississippi in the last few hundred years, because the population has moved that way. And then the population has really moved towards the Sun Belt, and Texas and Florida and Georgia. So states like that are really collecting people, but that's not a foregone conclusion. And Pennsylvania's leadership needs to be not complacent, because we are losing people. We have a brain drain. Right. We're losing young people. I'm from Philadelphia, and it's not as big a problem, although a lot of people have left Philadelphia as crime has increased and trash isn't getting picked up, which are issues that Broad and Liberty covers. But Pennsylvania itself, like a lot of states in the Northeast, and we have a lot of Rust Belt portions of Pennsylvania, should be very concerned about the business climate, the climate for families and taxpayers and retirees, people on a fixed income who are opting to leave the state for sunnier climes, and not just sunnier in the sense that it's warmer in the winter, but actually it's literally, it's not literally, it's better to live and cheaper to live. So that is a problem, and that's why we're losing population and losing representation in Washington.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up a really good point. That's now you're starting to get into some of the things that we really take a look at. When you look at Pennsylvania specifically, I mean, we're within an 8-hour drive of something like 30% of the U.S. population. You know, prime real estate essentially, and then we have an incredible energy infrastructure, education infrastructure. And yet the policies that are in place, you know, in places like Philadelphia and to a certain extent Pittsburgh, which are, you know, whether we like it or not, the major metropolitan areas of the state, tend to be hostile towards business at a local level. But there are also a lot of things at a state level that really just make Pennsylvania an unappealing place to set up shop or to expand a business. So as you were going through the historic precedents that have been set in Pennsylvania, outside of the Supreme Court, really, you know, in the last for the last redistricting, giving itself a lot of power, has there been consistency between the redistricting cycles that has just kind of really interrupted the last time around, or have there been significant changes over time?
Well, it's a great question, and we kind of track the history of gerrymandering, which is a term that came around in the early 1800s in Massachusetts, where I believe it was somebody who signed the Constitution, his founding father, his Massachusetts Governor Eldridge Gerry, signed off on what was his Democratic Republican Party. That was the name of the nascent political party, I think, versus the Federalists. And his district was shaped like a salamander, so people called it the gerrymander. And that's been an important part of the American lexicon ever since. So we track it. There's some interesting, we had a U.S. House speaker named Samuel Randall from the 1800s who had a gerrymandered district of Philadelphia wards where he just peeled off the Democratic Party. But of course, after the Civil War, Pennsylvania was a Republican majority state, but he was a Democrat, but he was still the Speaker of the House. And we tracked all this through, you know, the 1900s and into the late 20th century, where it was mostly a Democratic majority, and then it flipped in the 50s and 60s to be Republican majority legislature. That generally drew favorable maps for Republicans. Now, the issue that a lot of people have, that Citizens Alliance and a lot of academics on the left and right have brought up, is that because of more sophisticated map making tools, it has become science, and they've been able to, with a lot of precision, draw maps that are much, much more favorable, especially when there's one party rule. So in Maryland, just south of Pennsylvania, they're considering an 8-0 map, which means that they will almost certainly have 8 Democratic representatives from 8 Democratic-leaning districts, even though 30 or 40% of the state votes Republican, which really does disenfranchise a lot of people. In Pennsylvania, state Republicans have pursued pretty aggressive gerrymanders in the 2000s, in the 2010s, but constitutional gerrymanders, it's really up to the voters to decide if they don't like that and decide to vote for new leadership. So not the courts, right? So in the 2010s, a couple of things happened. One is that the issue of redistricting came to the national foray much more because the left largely had lost a lot of governorships in the second year of Obama's terms, had lost a lot of state legislature. So Republicans really had the advantage coming into the 2010s redistricting cycle. And frankly, Republicans do again this cycle, not as strong an advantage. So there was a lot of sort of sound and fury about the redistricting process and how it's, you know, like systemically favoring Republicans, which just isn't true. If you look at Maryland or California or New Jersey or New York, those are Illinois, those are Democratic states that draw Democratic maps. But also the state Supreme Court, which had historically been Republican representative the Pennsylvania Republican Party, and Republicans had gotten kind of complacent and allowed, over the course of several election cycles, several seats to flip, so that the state Supreme Court entered the decade with a Republican majority, exited the decade with a 5-2 Democratic majority. So the state Supreme Court became much more amenable and much more activist, which I know you guys follow at the Citizens Alliance, in inserting itself into social issues, political issues, granting itself rights. And then, of course, we have a media core outside of Broad and Liberty, which is the outlet I founded that just sort of cheerleads for whatever the progressive left wants. So the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan group that's really a left-leaning group, kept challenging the courts. The appeal to overrule the federal maps was taken on by the state Supreme Court in late 2017. And by early 2018, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court had ruled that for reasons of that they basically called in a bunch of left-leaning academics to validate, that the federal court map of the Pennsylvania congressional districts was unconstitutional at the state constitutional level, and that the legislature would have to rework it. But they gave the legislature an impossible deadline, so the state Supreme Court ended up redrawing the lines, which is pretty crazy. I mean, they're just moving the drawing power further away from the people. And it was a pretty outrageous move that we track in this report. So by 2018, for the first time, our state Supreme Court, the highest court in Pennsylvania, had decided basically to redraw the lines themselves, which is pretty unprecedented in the Pennsylvania Constitution. It's very clear that the state legislature should draw the lines, not the state judiciary. Everybody listening will understand the differences between the state legislature, judiciary, and executive. So by 2018, we had new maps, and they were cleverly drawn to benefit Democrats in a number of ways that we could talk about. But it really was the we would say, a gross abuse of judicial power from a partisan state Supreme Court.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because when you look at the composition of the Supreme Court going into that, we actually had one of the Supreme Court judges, I believe it was Justice Wecht, campaigning on overturning the maps, essentially, which is a violation of judicial canon. So while that step was unprecedented and those things were really what the Supreme Court did was completely out of line, it's interesting that the General Assembly did not reassert itself in the process by bringing articles of impeachment or anything like that against the judges. They just, engaged in very loud hand-wringing, and that was the extent of it. And I mean, from our perspective, that lack of action and unwillingness to reassert their position within the balance of power has really one of the things that laid the groundwork for Governor Wolf as we came into the pandemic to really take some unprecedented actions of his own, because he had a Supreme Court that was willing to go along with it. And also the legislature had shown a history of not being willing, at least over the course of the past couple of decades, not being willing to assert its authority under the constitutional system and take the power that it has, whether that's through the purse or through articles of impeachment and other mechanisms that have been put in place. So when we look at those districts that were drawn, and again, this is the at the federal level, when we look at those districts that were drawn, you had mentioned that the Pennsylvania Constitution very clearly delineates that's a legislative issue, or an issue for the legislature to decide versus the judiciary. Something that has come up, and not just in this context, but in others, is, okay, so if the judiciary makes a bad decision, where do we go next? And unfortunately, with redistricting, they did, if memory serves, take it. The legislature did file suit in federal court. The suit was dismissed because the decision that was made by the state Supreme Court was made under state law. So there's kind of the separation of powers thing. So as we look at this, and you bring up a good point that the Democrats really don't have an incentive to come to the table in this cycle in order to make sure that there are there are reasonable maps that are passed, what steps, as you've been watching the process play out, what steps are being taken by the General Assembly in order to, I guess, to demonstrate that they are working to create the best districts possible and really listen to what folks have to say about who their representatives are going to be in Washington?
Yeah, I think you have a lot of really good analysis in what you just said, and a bunch of different things. One of which is, yes, WECT and Democrats have taken to running on platforms that include obviously unconstitutional things, whether it's about free speech or the Second Amendment, or in this case, the courts redrawing maps. The American right has also yielded to sort of the executive state, and we see at the DC level, Washington federal level, at the Harrisburg level, we see state legislatures, federal legislatures abdicating their responsibility, just being in charge of basically massive spending bills, and that's it. And then the executive power growing and the power of the judiciary growing. So this was not the way that our country was established to be. We should have a stronger legislature that, regardless of its partisan leaning and its decisions, makes decisions, debates real issues, and is kind of in charge of setting the policy. The executive should execute the policies of the legislature. The judiciary should act as a check on both of those things. That's how it's supposed to be. So that's sort of the overall picture that we've seen in the last, 50, 70 years in America, is the shrinking of the legislature's powers, and the example of the state Supreme Court overtaking the state legislature and the state legislature basically having no response is a very exemplary one. As far as what they're doing now, state Republicans in the majority have pledged to have a more transparent process. That can obviously mean a lot of things, and they're accepting different maps. When I testified in front of the state government committee, the minority chair, Sharif Street, Democrat from Philadelphia, was very open and engaging and seemed to be committed to finding maps that are going to work with everybody. But at the end of the day, it's going to be hard to do that when the governor has no incentive to sign it, because mommy and daddy in the form of the state Supreme Court can always just redraw the maps to our liking. What I have suggested and what I've heard through this report, what I've heard is interesting to the legislature, is possibly pursuing some sort of constitutional amendment or legislation that says that the state Supreme Court either does not have judicial review over the maps that are drawn constitutionally by the state legislature, or that if they strike down the maps, that there's a process that takes place that gives the legislature ample time to, via the legislature, not by the court, to redraw these lines and according to the specification. So even if the state court is going to insert itself, which is a foregone conclusion, just because that's both their jurisprudence, that's their judicial philosophies, and also because every sort of bureaucrat lives to expand his or her own powers.
Right.
So the state Supreme Court, it's almost a foregone conclusion. And even in their decision, it was a 4-3 decision to redraw the maps. They indicate that, we have criteria A, criteria B, and criteria C for fair map drawing in the future. And all those criteria could be met by the PA legislature in the future, but there could be another problem that we can't foresee yet. So you can see in between the lines, you can see that they're setting the table for themselves to reinsert themselves in 2021 or 2022, or really anytime they feel like it. So we can just assume that they're going to do that. People who are watching should be plugged in, whatever their political orientation is, and groups like yours should and are plugged into what's going to happen, because we know the state Supreme Court and the state courts are going to insert themselves into the line drawing, and it's going to give a partisan advantage to the Democratic Party. And the state legislature is pursuing some interesting options, but we all need to keep our eye on the ball and create a process that in this state, that the state courts can't just pick up a pen and redraw the maps to their own liking.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up the idea of a constitutional amendment, because it would be a novel approach. It's also something that, even if they were to begin that process now, would not necessarily fix the maps, if and when the Supreme Court inserts themselves into it this time around. There's not a check on their power coming up for this. That would be more of a longer term, medium term solution, because we would be looking at least 2 legislative cycles before something like that could actually happen.
So a couple things just real quick. I mean, yes, you're right. We have to focus on the long-term solution, but we also have to focus on drawing maps that are good for the next decade. But the state legislature can, and what we recommend in this report is for both parties, go with what the state Supreme Court has said as far as what the criteria are going to be, and then dare them to redraw the maps according to their own whims. And then there will be a political backlash to that.
Yeah. 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 And unfortunately, it's in this period of time that we find ourselves in, I'm concerned that it would, again, just be a partisan backlash. You know, people would fall into the red team, blue team kind of dynamics, and we would end up with, well, you know, even though the Supreme Court said this was the criteria that they were going to follow, and they're now inserting more criteria, we would see, I would wager, very positive news articles from most of the media in the state saying that, you know, this is the right and proper role of the Supreme Court, and there would be no indication of the concerns that this should generate from people when it comes to the erosion of the authority of the legislature and to a certain extent to the executive branch. Because at this point we're kind of moving into a position where you know, we have kind of these folks in black robes making all the decisions. And historically speaking, that's not a very good image that one wants to emulate. So.
Yeah, you're right. And partly what we say in the report, which we say a lot in Broader Liberty internally and externally, is that civics education matters. And it's important for citizens. I mean, to have a functioning constitutional republic, it is going to be as good as its citizenry. So if you look at what's happening at a policy standpoint, as far as our sort of vitriol and tribalism and just lack of understanding of the systems around us, these are a result of the, you know, net goodness of the citizenry that we find ourselves in. So it's really, really important that people, you know, support good media, educate themselves, and a lot of people are self-educated. It's important that our institutions, including our public schools, K through 12, and our higher education, educate young Americans on what the process and what the, you know, checks and balances of our system are supposed to be. And there's a lot of short-termism and a lot of partisanship and a lot of people cheerleading, you know, when Trump did an executive action versus when Biden does one, it always flips immediately. And it makes people think that the only thing that matters is the red jersey, blue jersey. And it really doesn't. There has to be so much more than that. And it's really, on the one hand, quite depressing to see where we've come as far as people just blindly supporting partisan and no matter what the means are. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity and a lot of hunger for people to come more to the consensus and also just establish what the principles we're supposed to be living by are, and then judge things more consistently based on that and not whose side is winning.
Yeah, and I think that is certainly, that is a point that we would absolutely agree with. It's those underlying principles, it's the underpinnings of the process that are really what's important. And no matter which side is eroding those principles are getting eroded, and that is a very bad thing, kind of full stop, and that is an understatement. I want to thank you very much for coming on. The report that you guys put together is fantastic. As I mentioned, we do have the link to that in the comments section. For folks who are interested, your website is broadandliberty.com. I know that I personally have signed up for your daily email updates because I appreciate the content that you guys put out. It's a great perspective, and it's not one that is common, unfortunately, in journalistic circles. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day, and thanks very much for everybody who tuned in today.
Thank you so much for having me, and compliments to what you and your organization does as well. And I appreciate that you're on our email list.
All right, folks. we will not see you before Thanksgiving, so I hope everyone enjoys the day with their family. And again, thank you to Albert Eisenberg for coming on today and discussing their redistricting white paper.
Thanks, Leo.